Generally, when we add citric acid to a food, we're doing it to give it a tart taste or to drop the pH down and make it more acidic. When we add citric acid to meat, citric acid will attack the muscle, the meat structures. And as it attacks it, it kind of breaks it down and makes it a little bit more brittle. And it will give, in fact, at very high levels, will give the impression when you cut or break it, because it becomes very brittle, it'll look a lot like cast aluminum or cast iron when you break it. It gives it that grainy, kind of brittle feel to it, which is not always a good thing. It won't hurt the way it tastes. In fact, the more citric acid you put in, the more tart it will become, the lower the pH will go, but the more brittle it will also make the meat feel. Standard citric acid crystals can be coated with the hard polysaccharide maltodextrin. This acts as a prison cell. We can break the citric acid out of prison prematurely by excessive handling, regrinding, letting the citric acid remain in the batter for long periods of time before we cook it. Now, if we take it, we get our citric acid into our meat batter, we get our batter into the casing into the oven, our citric acid will remain contained where it cannot damage the meat structure until we heat it. As we're cooking it, we release the citric acid, we get the nice tartness we've come to expect out of a fermented sausage. But we're not using lactic acid, we're using citric acid. Lactic acid is produced by microorganisms that we're growing in our meat. They're alive. Sometimes when we grow them, we'll also grow something that poisons us. So this is a nice, safe alternative to trying to ferment our sausage. For 10 pounds of sausage batter, what does it cost us to use Fermento? First, suppose a 24-ounce jug of Fermento costs $12.60, excluding shipping, handling, taxes, that sort of thing. Let's just suppose. What is the cost then per ounce? $12.60 divided by 24 ounces gives you 53 cents an ounce. What does it cost to dose 10 pounds? The label says as a starting point use 3 pounds for each 100 pounds of meat, or 1 ounce for each 2 pounds of meat. So the starter load at bare minimum is 5 ounces. I have used twice that amount and did not get what I was looking for, and that's the maximum dose. So 2 times the 53 cents a pound times 10 pounds gives us $10.60. It will cost us to dose 10-pound batch of sausage batter $10.60. Here is a recipe for a mock fermentation powder. It has at its heart common encapsulated citric acid. That's not a very expensive component. It is kind of hard to measure sometimes when you're doing small batches like say 10 pounds. You would only need say half to 1 ounce per 10 pounds. Now if we mixed it with something like powdered buttermilk, a commonly available compound that we can get at any grocery store, we can mix them at known ratios and we'll actually get a fair mix that we can easily measure. It's easier to measure 3.5 ounces than it is to measure a ½ ounce, and it still gives us that nice tart presentation at a very economical price. This is just one example, excluding taxes and shipping and stuff. It's only $1.13 for a 10-pound batch. That's not real bad. And you can actually use a trace spice like paprika to ensure you get a good mix. Just mix it at the same time. You may find that the color of the encapsulated citric acid and the powdered buttermilk are very similar, so it may be difficult to tell when you have a uniform batch. The purpose of using a little trace, such as the paprika is bright red, and it's easy for you to see it as it gets mixed in there. When your batch looks uniform in presentation with that small amount of paprika, you can be assured that the maltodextrin covered citric acid is well distributed in your mix. Messing with that buttermilk's kind of got my taste buds in for a little bread, so I think while I'm got my cultured buttermilk out, I think I'm gonna make me some white bread, some fresh white bread. Got my little machine. I always work with a recipe because I can't remember squat. Got my little buttermilk powders, got my bread flour, and yeast and my water and egg and butter and salt's up there in the cabinet. We're gonna make us a little bread. I'm gonna tell you, when you work with food, you kind of smell things, you taste things, and there are a lot of products, maybe awfully good products, may not be what you're looking for. And you'll never know unless you try them. So I want y'all to try that Fermento, see if you like it. Want it to remain an option. Let you form your own opinion. I think I'm going to use the rest of what I have, and then I'm going to maybe try something maybe just a little bit more economical, a little more parsimonious. Hey, that'd be a good name for powders. Parsimonious Powders. You know, you see me often with my little thermometer, and you really should strive for some consistency no matter what, whether you're making a batch of bread or you're trying to make a batch of sausage. I'm trying for 80 to 85 degrees. That's on the upper end, but it's kind of winter time here, and I think my pan probably is a little cool. I like to mix my egg up like that so that what I end up getting when I put a cold egg in my just right water, I end up with something that may not be quite right. A little rounded, that ought to work. That's not a good measurement, but since I'm just throwing her in there for flavor, I'm gonna just go ahead and do that. It would take 2 hands. That cat over there smelling my buttermilk powder, she wants a taste. That ought to be good enough for government work. We'll add the rest of the ingredients to flour, and I know y'all know how to make a loaf of bread. I'm just going to go ahead and put the stuff in there and measure out. You do want to be real good on your hush honey, huh? Be real close on your salt and your yeast, because they need to be in close proportions to one another. Now, when you stop and think about what can go wrong in a loaf of bread, you can have your water too hot or too cold. That'll affect your yeast and what it does. Something else may actually grow in the background at that higher temperature or lower temperature. You can have too much or too little salt. That will let things either grow out of proportion, out of time, too fast, or maybe not grow at all. You can have too little background sugars, nothing for the yeast to eat. You can have not enough water so they don't communicate well. You can have just so many things. Too little yeast, too much salt. I mean, it really needs to be a dance of correct proportion. And that's why if you ever have a desire to try to ferment some sausage yourself, you really need to know what you're doing. That you might actually be growing something in your meat you have no clue what you're doing. And by the time you figure that out, it'll just be too darn late for you. So when you look around on the internet and you see these things, some of these recipes out there and procedures I've seen just scare the living crap out of me. I'll just be honest with you. I just can't imagine somebody trying to do it. But it's just amazing. That's why we use a simulated fermentation, like a good product like this Fermento, or maybe this powder, this Parsimonious Powder. I mean, use some sense. Encapsulated citric acid. Use something and then cook your sausage. Control your meat. Control your products, and you ought to be just fine. But I tell you what, think about a loaf of bread and what can go wrong. Well, I guess that's about it for this video. So what do you think?